When dealing with any New Testament letter, we have to deal with introductory matters. Who was it written by? Who was it written to? What was its occasion? And when was it written? In this lecture, we're going to specifically talk about who Galatians was written to and when. We deal with who it was written by in our lecture on Paul, as it talks about him as being part of the Jewish, Hellenistic, and Roman world. And we deal with the occasion of Galatians when we talk about Paul as a letter writer and talk about mirror reading. So who were the Galatians? Seems like an easy enough question. And the term Galatian was typically used to refer to a group of people originating out of Central Europe, but who migrated before the book of Galatians was written into Switzerland, southern Germany, northern Italy, France, Britain, and ultimately settled in what we know of today as the Balkans and Asia Minor or Turkey. And if you want more about that, you can see Ben Witherington's commentary on Galatians. Now, all of this migration happened around 278 BC, or before Common Era. So this was well before Jesus was born, perhaps somewhere between the life of Plato and the birth of Jesus, 278 BCE. And after a series of battles, the Galatian people settled in northern Asia Minor, bordered to the west by Phrygia, to the south by Cappadocia, to the east by Pontus, and to the north by Bithynia. So this is the ethnic Galatian people. In 189 BCE, or before Common Era, or before Christ if you prefer, the Galatians came under control by the Roman Empire, as well as all of the rest of Asia Minor. And the Romans called the region Galatia. Now, the ethnic Galatians spoke a Celtic dialect, and they were revered by those around them as warriors and mercenaries. Greeks and Romans considered the Galatians as barbarians or wildlings because of their strange dialect and their large physical appearance and their wild appearance. Now, in 64 BC, the province of Galatia became a favored kingdom by the Roman Empire and began to expand its territory far beyond where the ethnic Galatians lived. In fact, at least 13 Roman colonies were established in this growing and expanding province of Galatia. Among those colonies were places like Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, which are all mentioned in the book of Acts. So by the time of the Apostle Paul, the province of Galatia was very large and included many, many different tribal and ethnic groups, not just the ethnic Galatians who resided in the northern part of the Roman province. Now, why is this even important or relevant? Well, it makes sense whether Paul, in writing the church in Galatia, is writing to Christians who are ethnic Galatians, therefore in the northern part of the region, or whether he is writing Christians from all of these other various tribes and colonies that are in the province of Galatia. If it's the ethnic group Paul is addressing, then we know from the book of Acts that Paul did not visit the ethnic group of Galatia until his second and third missionary journey, which are recorded in Acts chapter 16 and Acts chapter 18. And if that's the case, that would mean that Galatians was written somewhere between 56 and 58 AD. This is called the Northern Galatian theory, since it claims that the Christians who comprise the Galatian church were ethnic Galatians located in the old kingdom of Galatia, which is in the northern part of the Roman province of Galatia. But if Galatians refers to the Roman province and not to the ethnic group, well, the book of Acts tells us that Paul visited that region in southern Galatia during his first missionary journey, recorded in Acts chapter 14. The southern province of Galatia included Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, and this would make the date of Galatians very earlier than the previous one, and that would put the date of Galatians around 48 AD, 8 to 10 years earlier than the northern Galatian theory. This is called the southern Galatian theory, since it means that the regions that Paul is writing to where Christians were in the southern part of Galatia that Paul visited during his first missionary journey. So the northern Galatian theory says 56 to 58 AD, and the southern Galatian theory says Paul wrote this letter around 48 AD. Most scholars today argue for the northern Galatian theory and the later date, although there are quite a few who argue for the earlier date. Now, why does this even matter? Well, it mostly matters because it tries to reconcile what Paul says in Galatians, especially in chapter 2, with the account we read in the book of Acts, especially the Jerusalem Council we read about in Acts chapter 15. Now, what is the Jerusalem Council? Hopefully you know that from your Luke Acts course, but in case you don't, here's a little bit of a refresher. The Jerusalem Council was a council that brought together all of the leaders of the church at that time to answer the question of how Jewish Christians would relate to non-Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians. Specifically, as more and more non-Jewish people became followers of Jesus, the question arose of how many, if any, Jewish practices they should take upon themselves. And so at the Jerusalem Council, we find James, Jesus' half-brother, presiding at the council. We also find Peter, who is the first to introduce the gospel to non-Jewish people in Acts chapter 10 with the household of Cornelius. And then we find Paul and Barnabas called in order to talk about what they've been doing as missionaries. And as the council meets, it specifically is trying to answer the question of whether these new non-Jewish Christians ought to be compelled to be circumcised to adopt Jewish culture and a Jewish identity, or whether they can continue on as non-Jewish people without undergoing circumcision or obeying the other laws of Israel, like the food laws and so on and so forth. So the council meets, and ultimately James concludes that Gentile or non-Jewish Christians ought not be compelled to be circumcised, but that they refrain from sexual immorality, from other things that would be offensive to Jewish Christians, like eating blood or eating animals found dead along the road, this sort of thing. That's the Jerusalem Council. Now, nowhere in Galatians does Paul mention this council, which leads Southern Galatian scholars to claim that that means Galatians was written before the Jerusalem Council happened, perhaps even weeks or months before it happened. Now, in Galatians chapter 2, Paul does describe a meeting that he and Barnabas have in Jerusalem. And Paul describes this meeting in Galatians 2 as a private meeting with the pillars of the church. He specifically identifies Peter, he calls him Cephas by his Aramaic name, James, the half-brother of Jesus, and the Apostle John. The way Paul describes this meeting in Galatians, Peter and James affirm Paul's gospel to the non-Jewish world. They consider Paul the apostle to the Gentiles, whereas Peter or Cephas is the apostle to the Jewish world. And according to Paul's account in Galatians 2, Peter and James give Paul and Barnabas what he calls the right hand of fellowship, which is their affirmation, their encouragement that they affirm their ministry, and they both agree that it's important for them to help the poor within the church. Southern Galatian scholars say this meeting is a different meeting than the Jerusalem Council because it was a private meeting and that it occurred before the Jerusalem Council. Northern Galatian scholars argue that either Paul doesn't mention the Jerusalem Council at all, even though it had already happened, or that this is Paul's account of the Jerusalem Council. Now, if that's the case, Paul's version of the Jerusalem Council is very different than what we read about in the book of Acts. So what do we conclude from this about who Galatians was written to and about when it was written? We can conclude one of two possibilities. First possibility, Paul wrote his letter either to various ethnic tribal groups that lived in the southern province of Galatia in 48 AD before the Jerusalem Council, which would make it the earliest Pauline letter, the earliest letter attributed to Paul. And possibly the earliest document that we have in the New Testament. Or Paul wrote his letter to ethnic Galatians located in the northern province of Galatia around 56 to 58 AD. And either he doesn't talk about the Jerusalem Council at all, or his description of it is very different than the description of it that we find in the book of Acts.